All right, well, let's make our way to Acts chapter 17. And by the way, the only reason I keep giving Beth a hard time on forgetting this, that it was the third Sunday, is because if you understood the rarity of the times I get to remind her of something, that almost never happens. So I have to relish in those few times that I get. Acts chapter 17. We kind of introduced this last week, and this is, of course, Paul in Athens as he stands before the group, the Areopagus, and, he had been preaching, and from an intellectual standpoint, they were intrigued. From a philosophical standpoint, they were intrigued. And it says that he was preaching to them Jesus and the resurrection. In verse 18, they wanted to hear more about this. And so they bring him, and we kind of talked about this last week, they bring him to the Areopagus, which was a rock outcropping, speaking to a group called the Areopagus. And it was the place was later referred to on as Mars Hill there at the time that Luke was writing. And so here we're going to start in verse 24. And so Paul saw these idols. He saw this idol to the unknown God. And so he says at the end of verse 23, he says, "Whom therefore you ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you." And so we pick it up in verse 24. It said, "God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Forasmuch then, as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. And the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead." It says, "And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, We will hear thee again of this matter. And so Paul departed from among them. Howbeit, certain men clave unto him, and believed, among them which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." And so, as we stated, Paul has started his message to the Areopagus there on Mars Hill, and this message is going to challenge the views and the ideologies that permeated the philosophical minds of Athens. He's going to show them that unknown God that they were ignorantly worshiping, and he was going to use essentially a very similar argument he writes to the Romans in Romans chapter 1, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. And we talked about last week how Paul is narrowing in their mindset from all of these hundreds or thousands of gods down to the one only true God. And so he does this using kind of what you might refer to as this natural revelation, that which is known and can be known by all. And so he does this, and he does this in a really magisterial way. And so furthermore, because this God exists, and here's the crux of the whole sermon, because this God exists, we, everyone, not just they, but we, all of us, have a responsibility to respond to that God. We have a responsibility to respond to that God. And so, let's just jump right into it. Verse 24, "God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands." And so Paul starts really at the beginning. He starts at a tremendous place, which is the truth of creation. He starts with the truth of creation, because I just read from Romans 1. This is that natural revelation that every man can see. Every person can see this. And so this unknown God, the one who they're ignorantly worshiping, the unknown God is the Creator God. Now, this would fly in the face of the pantheism of the Stoics. You remember last week we talked about the Stoics and the Epicureans. This would fly in the face of the pantheism of the Stoics, because God created nature and was distinct and separate from his creation. In other words, the Stoics believe that God was nature, right? And so God created the earth. He is not the earth. He created it. He's distinct from it, not just distinct from it, but Lord over it, right? And so this is a distinct belief that they would have not agreed with. And so he is the Lord of heaven. He is the Lord of earth. He isn't, in fact, earth, right? This is a very distinct difference. Now, before going on talking about the theology of this, Paul's argument here, and I just wanted to note this, completely works against the modern ideologies of the Big Bang and evolution. Okay, and so there are some, I'll say well-meaning, there are some well-meaning Christians who try to incorporate Big Bang and evolution into a creation mindset. And so in other words, what they'll say is that God created the world, he just used the Big Bang and then evolution to do it. And so essentially they would say God created very basic elements that existed that then happened to come into to being with the Big Bang, and then through those basic elements there was evolution and the process of change and adaptation, all the things they teach, and then we get eventually from the Big Bang to Adam and Eve. And so basically they try to incorporate modern scientific theory into Scripture. But there's problems. There's a lot of problems with this, but there's big problems with this. First of all, what Paul says here, he says that God made the world and all things therein. God made the world and all things. In other words, he didn't just make the basic elements that existed and then expand it in the Big Bang. That's not what it says. God made the world and all things therein. And if we understand that, and especially in a concordance with Genesis chapter 1, if he made the world, I think we can assume that within that, Paul would have included the earth. Those who hold to the Big Bang and those who hold to evolution believe that the earth wasn't created with the Big Bang, but came along much, much later as a result of all these things swirling around in space, and just this big ball was kind of created and eventually became what we know as the earth. That does not fit with the biblical accounts of creation. If God created the world and all things therein, you can't have both. You can't have the Big Bang. You can't have evolution. And that's just one of a couple of reasons why I just would absolutely dismiss these ideas, particularly when you understand that the origin of the ideology behind evolution, the origin of the ideology behind the Big Bang, is to explain our world without the need for a creator. That's the whole reason they came into being. And so this certainly doesn't match with what Paul says, nor the biblical account of creation. But go back to the text here. As creator, since he created it, he's Lord over it. He is the Lord over his creation. He's the Lord of heaven. He is the Lord of earth. This is his creation. He controls it. He is sovereign over it. And if it's his creation, he decides how it's run. He decides how it operates. He decides how we, as the creation, should respond to our Creator. We read in Colossians chapter 1, he, speaking of Jesus, he is before all things, and by him all things consist. What does that tell us? That without him, without God, first of all, there is no world, and secondly, without him, the world ceases to continue. The only reason that we have a world, and the only reason the world continues to exist, is because God created it, and he's holding it together. He's keeping it together. What does that tell us? He is sovereign over it. He controls it. He is the Lord of it. As such, and this should just be the logical outworking of this thought, as such, he cannot be contained by it. Now think about this. This is logical. If he created it, and only by his hand does it consist, does it continue, does it keep circling and doing all the things that our world has to do, if it's only by him that these things happen, how prideful of us as humans must we be to think, well, I'll build that God a temple. I'll build that God a temple where he can dwell. He's going to come dwell in this little insignificant building that I have made. This God who created our world and by his hand keeps it all together, he's going to come dwell in this temple that I, his creation, have made. Right? And so this is, he can't be contained by this. He cannot be, the text says, he dwelleth not in temples made with hands. We won't take the time to go back and look at it, but this is the exact same argument that Stephen used when he was speaking to the Sanhedrin back in chapter 7. One of the things they accused Stephen of is kind of blasphemy against the temple. And Stephen used the same argument. How dare you think that our God who created the world dwells in a temple made by hand, could be contained, let me put it that way, could be contained by a temple made by human hands. He has no need, let me put it this way, he has no need of men. He doesn't need us. He chooses to love us. He chooses to send his son to die for us. He chooses to spend eternity with us, but he does not need us. The Creator does not need his creation. He doesn't need men, either in the making of temples or in the upkeeping of them. He says in the next verse, verse 25, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. But look at that phrase there right in the middle, as though he needed anything. I really love that phrase. All the temples, all the various idols that existed in Athens, and we talked about this last week, there were so many of them. Not just idols, there were so many temples. Vast, huge, amazingly large temples, which I love that Paul is saying that this wasn't enough to contain, because they were standing in light, we talked about last week, of the Parthenon, this amazingly huge building, a lot of which still stands there today. You can go there and see it. And here's Paul saying, it's not enough. It's not enough. That cannot contain the God who created our world. And so all these temples, all these various idols needed human intervention. Meaning, without the hands of man, those temples would eventually fall apart. Those idols would all eventually crack and break, which should tell them something, right? They should be able to, again, these men are thinkers. They should be able to logically put these things together. If I, as a man, have to upkeep this idol or upkeep this temple, without me, without my intervention, it will eventually fall away, decay, break apart. What does that tell me about the so-called God it represents? It's nothing. Those gods that they worship, quote-unquote gods, were completely dependent upon man. What kind of God is that? Why is that somebody you want to worship? In contrast, the only real God, the true God, is independent of the need of man. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. Man is completely dependent upon him. It says, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. So unlike all these false gods of Athens who need these men to come in and upkeep and do all the things they do, create them even to begin with, as opposed to that, we can do nothing outside of our God. It's only by our God that we have life to begin with, that we have breath in our lungs. The fact that you and I woke up this morning, it was simply because God allowed it to be so. Thomas Constable said, the true God also sustains all things. He does not need people to sustain him. In other words, he is immanent as well as transcendent. He's immanent as well as transcendent. He participates in human existence. This contradicted the Epicureans' belief that God took no interest in human affairs, as well as the Stoics' self-sufficiency. And so by these statements, he is literally flying in the face of both of these major philosophical groups who are questioning him. And so I like the fact that he says that God is both immanent as well as transcendent. He's transcendent in that he is above, he doesn't need us. He's outside of us. He created us, but he's also immanent in that even though all of those things are true, he still works among us. He sent his son to be one of us, right? So he's transcendent and he's immanent. And so Paul starts with this wonderful argument of creation. And by the way, I'll just add this. If ever you're talking to somebody who agnostic or even atheistic, which, no, that's a whole other argument for another time. We're talking to somebody who's agnostic or atheistic. Creation is a wonderful place to begin. Creation is such a good argument for the existence of God. But then he moves on to another argument. Verse 26. And it hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. And so he then speaks of another facet of God that would strike at their ideology. And so he moves from the creator God, now he moves to the sovereign God. So he moves from creation to God's sovereignty. And so God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. I get really irritated and just frustrated with all the talks about race. All the talks about race, because the Bible tells us there are not many races. There is one race. We are one blood. We all have our father Adam, and ultimately we are all created in the image of God. And so there's not all these various races. If you want to talk about ethnicity, fine. But as far as race, we are all one race. And this idea would, again, really strike at the heart of, in particular, the Athenians. All the Greeks, but in particular the Athenians, because the Athenians consider themselves superior to everybody. In fact, a lot of their writings, you see this. They really thought they were better than everybody else, and if the Athenians were the best, the Greeks were better than everybody else. If you were not an Athenian, if you're not a Greek, you were a barbarian. That's what they taught, that's what they believed. There was an Athenian orator, and his name was Isocrates. He's once said this in a speech, and this really defines well the Athenian ideology. He said, "For we did not become dwellers in this land by driving others out of it, nor by finding it uninhabited, nor by coming together here a motley horde composed of many races, but we are of a lineage so noble and so pure that throughout our history we have continued in a possession of the very land which gave us birth, since we are sprung from its very soil." In other words, he's saying nobody else drove us from any land. We are born of Athenian soil. We are pure-blooded Athenian superiors. That's what their ideas were. Everybody else is barbarian. You can't touch the purity of the Athenian. And so here Paul says, no, everybody's of one blood. We're all of one blood because God created every one of us. And so Paul shows that we're all one blood. We all come from the same man, Adam. We all come from God, right? There's no superiority as far as bloodlines are concerned. Now, furthermore, that same God who created all of us, made us all of one blood, that same God hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. Again, they wouldn't have liked this. Now, exactly what this is supposed to mean is pretty debated. This is probably the most debated verse of this whole section. But what Paul clearly says is that God determines a nation's times, and that he determines a nation's bounds. And so a lot of people debate about what exactly Paul meant by times and what exactly Paul meant by bounds, but I'll just give you my opinion on this. I believe Paul to be saying that God determines the times, meaning the time and the power and the reign of a nation, and he determines the bounds. In other words, their physical location, their borders. And so, in other words, Paul is knocking down the Athenian ideology that they're a superior race, and that the Athenians, or rather the Greeks, is a superior country. No, we're all one blood, and by the way, the only reason Greece was ever what it was is because God made it so. And so, in other words, it is up to God not only where your nation is, but it is up to God how powerful and how influential that nation will be. God is sovereign over every nation. He's not just the God of the Israelites, right? Kind of this is the argument he's making. He's not just the God of the Israelites. He is the God of the world. He said it earlier, he's the Lord of heaven. He's the Lord of earth. The only reason Greece or Athens ever had it, whatever it had, is simply because God gave it to them. And so the Athenians, who had no idea that it was God who gave them the influence that they had, were patting themselves on the back, thinking that this was something they had made, thinking that this was something that they had done. It was a very prideful mindset. It says, Daniel said, Daniel deals with the same topic. He said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever." He says this, "For wisdom and might are his." Wisdom is his, not ours, but his. He says, "And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings. He setteth up kings." It's all by God. Right? And so, Nebuchadnezzar, you can beat yourself on your chest all day long and say, "Look at the kingdom that I have built." But every ounce of power and influence you have was given to you by God. And as easily as he gave it to you, he can take it away from you. Well, Paul's saying the same thing to the Athenians. This city is not built upon your backs. This influence, this power, everything that you think you have it because God has allowed it to be so. And look at what Paul says next. And this is so amazing. Paul is appealing to what I refer to as kind of these natural revelations of God. God's creation, and just follow logically, if he's the creator, he's sovereign over it, right? Creation, sovereignty. Why? Why has he done this? Why has he revealed himself in this manner? Well, verse 27 answers that. So we have a cause and effect here. That they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. And so he's given these arguments. God has revealed himself in creation. God has revealed himself as sovereign. Why? So that you will search for him. So that you will seek after him. The wording that he used, if you're having to feel after something, kind of find your way by feeling, it's almost as if he's describing either a person in pitch blackness or even possibly a blind person, right, trying to find their way by feeling along the wall or whatever, trying to find what they're doing by just feeling around. And so he says this is what's happening. You're trying to feel around, and you're trying to find this God. And unfortunately for the Athenians, what they've done is they're feeling around trying to find God, and they thought they found him, and they put him up on these idols, and they put him up in these temples, and they made God out to be Zeus and Jupiter and these other things. You're feeling out for the one true God, and you've misapplied those truths that you have seen, that there is a creator, that there's a sovereign God. You've taken those truths and you've misapplied them and placed them upon Zeus and others. And so you're feeling after him, and he says, look, God's not far. It's not like God has given us all these truths and then has hidden himself away from man, and as he's laughing up in heaven thinking, they'll never find me. No, he's not far. He's made it there. He's made himself accessible. And so there's enough evidence of God for the lost to feel their way towards him. And again, creation is the best way to do this. Now let me say this, because it's important to understand this. That's not enough evidence to save a person. That's not enough evidence to get a person to heaven. You must have the gospel for that. You don't go to the heaven. You don't go to heaven outside of the gospel. However, a person who is truly seeking God will find him. Will find him. Let me give you some scripture on this. The psalmist writes in Psalm 145, the Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth. He will fulfill the desire of them that fear him. He also will hear their cry and will save them. This is something we talked about a couple of chapters ago when we were discussing the Ethiopian eunuch. And one thing, and it's the same exact arguments being made here, I talked about then, whereas, we have the evidences of God surrounding us in nature. And if a person is truly seeking to know that God, even if there's no gospel witness, the Bible tells us that he will get that truth to that person. The Ethiopian eunuch is a perfect example of this. He was seeking God. He didn't know him. He was seeking God. And so what did God do? He sent him the gospel. Right? He didn't have to go to the right place. He didn't have to find the right person. God literally sent it to that man. And so again, if somebody is out there, all these people who live in areas of the world where there is no gospel witness, if they are seeking God and doing so in truth, God will get that person the gospel. It's not as if God is up there thinking, well, I just sure wish somebody would go tell that person about Christ, but my hands are tied. I can't do anything about it. No, God will get that person the gospel. And then interestingly enough, Paul actually quotes from their poets. It's an interesting argument that he uses. Look at verse 28. He says, for in him we live and move and have our being. He says, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Now there's two sources that we know for sure, a possible third source that Paul is referring to here. But the ones that we know, I'll give you. The first one is a quotation of a poem by a poet named Epimenides about Zeus. Both of these, in fact, are about Zeus. He writes this poem about Zeus. The fourth line of that poem reads, we live and move and have our being. Well, he's writing that about Zeus, but Paul takes that and applies it to God. The second one is a quotation from a man named Aratus, also in a hymn to Zeus, part of which of that hymn reads, for we also are his offspring. And so Paul is quoting from two known Greek poets saying things that every person on that Areopagus would have known. They would have known it as soon as Paul said it. But here's the argument that Paul is making. Your poets could see the truths that God is talking about. Again, they to use argument earlier, they've been trying to feel their way toward God. And he said, and God's not far, but they missed it because they misapplied it. That's what we talked about earlier. They misapplied it. They took the truths of God and they did what? They put them upon Zeus. They put them upon a God of their own making. And so Paul is telling them, again, the truth of God can be seen. Why does, and think about this from this perspective, why does Zeus, why does Jupiter, why does Mars, why do, Athena, why do all these other false gods exist? Why do people seek after gods? Because the truth of the God is there, and they see that, and they realize it, and they want to express, some kind of devotion towards that, but they're missing the mark in their application. They're taking what should be given to the one true God, and they're applying it to these other false areas. Again, it's the exact same argument that Paul makes in Romans chapter 1. It's the creation, worshiping the creation instead of the Creator. Why? Because they're placing upon gods of their own making the honor, the devotion, the worship that should be going to the Creator. But instead, they're placing it upon another creation. And so here he uses their own poets. Why? Because their poets can see this truth. Paul is saying, you've seen this truth. You know this truth. Your poets have seen it. You've seen it. You're just misapplying it. And so it's as Paul said in Romans, they had changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator. This is exactly what they're doing. This is exactly what people still do today. They could see the truth of God, but in their pride and in their hubris, they thought the creature could create God, the Creator. That's what they thought they could do. Now, Paul then turns all this truth and he gives an application. And so verse 29. It says, "For as much then as we are the offspring of God," again, I agree with your poets. They just messed up on who this God was. "For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device." And so he starts here. And so he moves into an application here. All this truth he's bringing to a head here. I'll quote Darrell Bock on being the offspring, on that phrase, the offspring. He says this: "The theology behind this idea is that humanity is made in the divine image, which means that human beings are living, animated, conscious beings, not objects like idols. So God must be the same and more." God must be the same and more. And so, again, this is a very logical argument. If we are his offspring, then he cannot be less than us, right? If we come from him, he cannot be less than us. In other words, why would you think that this idol is anything if it represents a God who must be by nature more than you? Why do you think you can create him? Why do you think he can be less than you? Thus, it is impossible to make God something then that has been created by the man, by the hand of man. And so he starts there, and then he says this in verse 30. He says, "In the times of this ignorance, God winked at." And so, let me just say this first of all. Paul knows what he's saying here. Paul fully understands the depth of what he's saying here. And he says, the time of this ignorance God winked at. He would have offended every single ear that was listening to him that day by saying, what you are doing is ignorant. What we've been talking about with the Athenians, what do they pride themselves on? They pride themselves on their knowledge. What did we read earlier? We saw this last week. It says in verse 21, it says, "For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing." They prided themselves on their knowledge. They prided themselves on their intellect. They prided themselves on their openness to ideas and ideology. In other words, it fits in what we were talking about earlier. The Athenians truly thought there is no people greater or smarter than the Athenians. And here's Paul saying, you've been doing something in ignorance. That would have been highly offensive to them. But I tell you what they were doing was offensive. And it was right for Paul to offend them. Sometimes people need to be offended. Now, if you're doing it in love and you're doing it in the right manner, it's a good thing. It's the right thing. And I say this all the time. The gospel is offensive. If you were giving somebody the gospel, what you were telling them is, you are not good. You are not good. They think you're good. You're not. You are a sinner who can do nothing about your sinful condition. And guess what? People don't like to be told they're a sinner. People don't like to be told the things that they've done their whole life are actually bad and are actually wrong and are actually of their father, the devil. I'll tell you what, that is offensive. But they need to hear it. Because without that, what's going to happen to them is far worse. They're going to spend an eternity separate from God. And so sometimes it is good and right to be offensive. Now, you got to do it in the right way, and it has to come from a heart of love. That's exactly what Paul is doing here. And so he tells them, right, you've been doing this ignorantly, and the times of this ignorance God winked at. And so God has been allowing this to take place. God has overlooked this ignorance for some time. And by that, what he means is that this pagan system, this ideology, this idolatry, all of this, God has winked at this formally, meaning he has not come down in righteous judgment on you or on these systems as thoroughly as his righteousness and holiness allows. There's a certain degree of judgment which has not yet happened, and because God has been allowing this to take place for some time. Now, however, something is different. Something has changed. And so he says, the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth he all men everywhere to repent. And so something has taken place within the bounds of history that has changed. And whereas God winked, he's not winking anymore. What is he talking about? That which has changed, the Son of God, meaning the incarnation. Jesus has come. God in the flesh has walked upon this earth. He's lived in perfect fulfillment of the law of God. He died in your place. He has resurrected again. All of this has caused a change. So he says, because he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man, which is Jesus. And by the way, they would know that. The text doesn't tell us that here, but they would know that because that's the whole reason Paul was speaking to them in the first place, because he was preaching to them Jesus and the resurrection. He said, we want to hear more about that. So when he says, by that man whom he hath ordained, they know who he's talking about because he's already talked about it. He's already taught it. And so because of the incarnation, God no longer winks. He will send his perfect Son in righteous judgment over the world. You're not going to get away with this idolatry. You're not going to get away with worshiping, like we talked about last week, some words, estimates of 30,000 gods. It's not going to work for you. Man will be held accountable to his Creator. And that is, well, let me just say this. That's an offensive truth. People understand the implications of it, but it is the truth that they need to hear. The Bible tells us it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. It ought to be a fearful thing to every living human being to know or to even think of the possibility that one day they will indeed stand in judgment before their God. That they will stand in judgment before the Creator, before the sovereign God, for the one who knows them intimately more so than anybody else ever possibly could, who knows their thoughts, who knows their intentions, who knows every deed they have ever done, every sin they have ever committed. They will stand in judgment before that God. And Paul says, listen, if you don't believe me, he's given us proof. He's given us an assurance that that judgment will come. What is that assurance? He says, whereof he has given us assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. And this calls back to, again, the very reason why they're questioning him in the first place. All right, in verse 18, he says, he seemed to be a setter forth a strange God because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. Right, and so this is the whole reason he's there. Right? The resurrection is a truth. It is a reality. It's not some myth. It's not something that the disciples made up. God raised his Son from the dead, and that is an assurance to us, not only of our future resurrection, but of the fact that God is coming again to judge the earth. I'll quote John Phillips here. He said, there is a resurrection unto life for the believer, but there is also a second resurrection, a dreadful resurrection, a resurrection to damnation for the unbeliever, and Christ's resurrection guarantees that as well. All judgment has been committed by God to his Son, who being both God and man, is equipped to act as mediator now and magistrate then. It is that aspect of Christ's resurrection that Paul solemnly brought before the frivolous Athenians. There was to be no more excuse for their philosophical dabblings and their religious delusions. Again, what does the Bible tell us over and over? Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They have talked themselves out of the realization and understanding of the existence of God. The same thing, like I said, such a relevant passage of Scripture. The same kinds of things are happening today. We talked about this a little bit last week, but we live in an age of enlightenment. Everybody thinks that they're enlightened. And inevitably, where that kind of ideology leads you is to the fact that either, A, there is no God, or B, everything is God. And by the way, if everything is God, then nothing is God. And so ultimately, both are the same idea. You have the atheist who says there's no God. You have the pantheist who says, no, we're all gods. Everything is God. That's the same idea. It's the same thing in essence. It's the same thing. And so we live in this age of enlightenment where people think that they're so spiritually in tune, and they think they're so wise that they have convinced themselves that the Scriptures are false. Professing themselves to be wise, they have become fools. Now, it's possible that Paul was not done, and that he was going to continue speaking to them, continue developing this idea a little bit more. But we see in verse 32, it says, "And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, we will hear thee again." And so when Paul finally gets to this application, he talks about the resurrection as the assurance of coming judgment. When he brings up the resurrection, as if they stepped in and said, we're this is the same thing he's been talking about before. We're done listening to this. Others said, you know what? No, I think this is interesting. We need to hear some more about this. But I think it's likely that Paul probably wasn't done, and that he got interrupted, and that they basically just said, that's it, we're not listening anymore. And so here again, verse 32, some mocked, others not necessarily believed, but were intrigued. We'll at least put it that way. And this follows. I mean, this is really much on par with what we have seen already in the other places that Paul has gone to. Some believed, some didn't. If you've ever witnessed, what you will find, some believe, some don't. This is how these things go. But as far as the resurrection matter is concerned, this is very much in keeping with Athenian ideology. The Epicureans believed that there was no afterlife. There was nothing, that this is everything. This life is everything. The Stoics believed in a temporary afterlife. And so there might be something, but it is certainly not an eternal something. Many of the Greeks believed in an afterlife where the soul was taken away from the body, and they would kind of see that as a freeing, that our bodies are a hindrance to the soul. And so when the soul goes to the afterlife, it's freed from the body, and that's a good thing. But almost all the Greeks, most of them at least, did not believe in any physical resurrection. And so when Paul is talking about the resurrection, he's not talking about our souls going on and living in it. He's talking about a physical resurrection of the body, an idea that he develops greatly in other places, such as 1 Corinthians. But he's talking about a physical resurrection, and so they mock him. Right? No, that can't be. And again, this is almost you can understand why they would come to this. Why? Because there's graves everywhere. There's tombs everywhere. If we go dig up those tombs, guess what's there? They're bones, right? How can you say there's a physical resurrection? Well, they just didn't understand and didn't give Paul the time to develop this thought further, that there will be in the future a physical resurrection, but they begin to mock Paul. Now, on the other side of that, it said, some said, we will hear thee again of this matter. Well, it's just like we said last week, this doesn't necessarily mean, we hope that it does mean this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they were convicted, that they heard Paul, there was conviction in their heart, and they think, well, we need to hear more about this. No, again, go back to what the Athenians did all day, every day. What do? We like to listen to people tell us things we've never heard before. We like to listen to philosophy. We like to listen to theology. We like hearing new ideas. This is great. This is what we do all the time. And so, Paul, we've never heard this before, and we want to hear more about this. Now, again, the hope is that maybe that there was some conviction, but we don't necessarily need to take away from that there was conviction. Philosophers never really rush into new beliefs, right? They take their time. They think about these things, and they compare and contrast them to other ideas. And so, again, we don't necessarily see conviction in that particular group. But we see in verse 33, Paul, again, he understands that his moment, at least there at that particular time, was over. So verse 33 says, so Paul departed from among them. But there was, however, and Luke does such a wonderful thing here, there was a third group. It wasn't just those who mocked, and it wasn't just those who said, well, we just want to hear more about it because we're curious. He says, verse 34, albeit certain men clave unto him and believed. And so there was another group. Two of them are mentioned specifically. It says he says, among them was Dionysius the Areopagite. And so he was part of that group that was questioning Paul. Paul's words got through to him, and he was convicted. and he believed. Now again, a lot of people come to this particular sermon on Mars Hill, and they actually say, well, Paul never gives the gospel, and Paul should have said this and that. But again, you got to understand, this isn't the first time Paul's speaking to these people. Paul had been speaking with them. He'd been disputing with them. He had told them about Jesus. He had told them about the resurrection. This is just them wanting to hear more about the matter. So the gospel has been given. And so based upon what Paul said here, in conjunction with the gospel, this man Dionysius was able to understand and know the true God and come to salvation. And the same thing with this woman Damaris, which, again, we don't know anything about these people, but they're specifically called out. Perhaps they're influential. We don't know the case, but these two, and it says, and others with them, came to know the gospel, came to know the one true God. They came to see to use John Phillips, the frivolous nature of all these idols, of all these temples, the hubris of thinking that I created this, I made this for God, God needs me. They understood the absolute absurdity of this ideology. And they came to see and know the truth that no, there is one God, and that God is the Creator. And because He's Creator, He is sovereign over His creation. And if He's sovereign, I am bound to respond in the way He wants me to respond. And so in this text, and just by way of conclusion, in this text then we see the importance of simply getting people to see God for who He is. Now, that might seem like a simple phrase. But today, well, it's not just today, but really all people of all times, they try to come up with new and fresh ways to present God. They think if I can just come up with this new pragmatic program, right? If I can come up with this one niche, and I can present God in this one niche way, and I can get people to see God then through, here's what they're doing, through my wisdom. We don't need to do that. Just give people God. Just show them who He is. I don't have to come up with some full way to do it. I don't have to be the greatest orator. I don't have to speak grandiloquently. I don't have to have all that. I just need the Scriptures, and I need natural revelation, and I can show people God exists, and He is who He claims to be. And that's all they need. He is the sovereign Creator. He is the righteous judge of this world. He has shown Himself in the world that He has created. He has shown His power over that creation by resurrecting His Son, and by doing so, showing the truth of His coming judgment. People need to know these things. And so because of this, we are all responsible then to the Lord of heaven and earth. And as Paul told them, now He commands everyone everywhere to repent. And so let us do our job of telling others of the God who created them, the God who is near to them, and that God who is coming again. Let's pray.